and I welcome you to our second Legislative Advocacy Day workshop. This workshop will be focusing on promoting fair lending practices. Thank you for being with us. I ask that you remain muted until we reach the questions and answers portion of the program. Our opening reflection for social justice comes from our daily prayer guide and program resource book. Faith in seeking justice isn't always a straightforward connection. We often separate the two because it feels safer. As people of faith, what should be our commitment to those who are poor, vulnerable, and oppressed? Justice goes beyond meeting immediate needs and seeks to overturn the systems that uphold people's oppression and vulnerabilities. Let us pray from our daily prayer guide. Almighty God, we thank you for the women of United Women in Faith who create a heartbeat for our community, housed and unhoused, those with means and those with none, multicultural, multi-faith, each searching. Let them sit together and taste love at your table. Amen. And now I'm going to turn our program over to Andrea Causey. She'll be sharing the upcoming information with you. Is Andrea with us?
I don't see anyone by that name.
Okay. Patricia, do you have the information Andrea was going to share?
No, I don't have it in front of me. I would have to go to my email.
Okay, well, I guess I will introduce our speakers and they can tell you about themselves at the beginning. All right, our speakers for this evening are the Reverend Amari Hooker and Sue Berkowitz. And I know they're both very involved with the issues with fair lending practice, and we look forward to hearing what you have to share. So go ahead.
Yes, ma'am. Can someone make me a co-host so I can share my screen? Okay. Thank you very much, and I'll take it from here. There's an introduction slide that I'll get to and give you a little bit more about me. And Sue, good evening, United Women of Faith. I just want to champion you for doing this, and thank you for inviting me. And Sue, continuing the fight for social justice and those things we do are great, and we just thank God for this opportunity to share. I've entitled my portion of the evening, Why Jesus Turned Over the Tables at Payday Lenders. And I think that's a good place for us to kind of get into. And I want to kind of start by sharing, just a little bit of a song that comes from one of the other groups that I'm working with, the Poor People's Campaign, and I think you all will enjoy this. I went down to the rich man's house. I took back what he stole from me. I took back my dignity. I took back my humanity. Well, I went down to the rich man's house and I took back what he stole from me. I took back my dignity. I took back my humanity. And now it's under my feet. It's under my feet. It's under my feet. It's under my feet. Ain't gonna let no system walk all over me. Oh Lord. Oh Lord. I went down to Washington, D.C. I took back what they stole from me. I took back my dignity. I took back my humanity. I went down to Congress and I took back what they stole from me. I took back my dignity. I took her back. Oh, 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 oh. Yeah, 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 yeah. Ain't gonna let no system walk all over me. Have mercy, Lord. Have mercy on me, Jesus. I went down to Washington. I took back what they stole from me. I took back my dignity. Took back my humanity. I went down to the state capitals and I took back what they stole from me. Look here. Every state in the nation, every state in the nation, we gotta go. We gotta go. We gotta go. We gotta go. Ain't gonna let no system walk all over me.
And I think that kind of gets us where we're going. Hope you all enjoyed that. Basically, with me and Sue kind of put forth, and I don't know if we get through all of this, but want to do a little opening remarks and presentation of who we are. And then I'm going to, in segment 2, I'm going to focus on the biblical principles and Christian perspectives on debt and debt advocacy. Because I basically, when I looked at it, I said, oh, it's a bunch of stuff I can talk about. But I wanted to kind of stay in my lane and focus on why it is that the Christian, why it is the United Woman of Faith would engage the issues of predatory lending. And then in the our third component, Sue Berkowitz is going to come back and really give us some of the nuts and bones of this whole predatory lending and where we are with fair lending and the Fair Lending Alliance. And then we'll come back with a little discussion towards segment 3 and questions and answers and the end of the presentation. So at this time, what I want to do next is just go into a little bit of, I guess, presentation. Reverend Amari Bernard Hooker. I pastor Wesley Chapel in Lake City. I've chaired the advocacy ministry team. I've been with you all when you were United Methodist Women several times, speaking on behalf of the Poor People's Campaign and on racial reconciliation through the annual conference. I'm a trainer for both the Poor People's Campaign as well as a NAACP trainer. And I am the current SCJ Southeast Jurisdictional Chair of Black Methodists for Church Renewal. Sue, do you want to unmute now or just come back and introduce yourself when we switch persons?
I can just introduce myself when I get started. So I want you to have as much time as you need.
And I'm going to try to stay into my time. So basically what I want to cover is biblical and Christian perspectives on debt and debt advocacy. And this is where I want to start. Basically I want to start with the Samaritans and interest. And I want to start with interest because I think you all need to know the basis of predatory lending is interest and interest rates and how they affect our people and how they affect the community. And in summer, or Samaritan, where we pretty much start with modern day understanding of civilization, interest was Moss, and Moss really meant cattle. And then as we move forward into Greek civilization and Egypt civilization, the word myth means also to give birth. And this is interesting because these were actually positive ideas and ideals based on the fact that interest meant to increase something, and it came from the perspective of the lender. So the lender was the one that was happy to get something. And then when you start looking at the Cappadocians and 2250 and 2251 before Christ, the interest basically guaranteed the weight of silver and gold. And then I think some of you may have heard of the Harambe, the Hamba Code and the Code of Hambari, which includes banking practices. And there were some 100 articles on interest way back then in BC and the 2000 BCs. Even the Babylonians were accustomed to charging interest. So we see where this discussion of interest really comes from. And then we move forward to the Old Testament. And this really fascinated me when I first started to take it, that basically there were rules set up in the Old Testament that if you lend money to any of my people with you who is poor, you should be him as, you should not be him as a creditor, and you shall not exact interest from him. Basically, we see way back in Exodus 22 that as the Hebrews were moving forward, as they were going into the land, as these Jewish people moved, there was a whole understanding that you shouldn't charge interest on your brothers and sisters. You know, that was just a bad thing, and not to do it. And you even see down here in Deuteronomy, the 23rd chapter, you should not lend upon interest to your brothers and sisters. You know, that whole idea of not lending interest on victuals, and that's food stuff, interest on anything that was lent for interest. To a foreigner, well, that's interesting. You may lend interest, but to your brothers, you shall not lend interest. Once again, this idea that you shouldn't take from your brothers and sisters, those closest to you, and that you should be kind to them and not take from them. Now, just a little bit more to kind of wet your whistle. There was not a prohibition. And it says basically the reason for there not being a prohibition of receipts by Jews from interest and the Gentiles vice versa is held by modern rabbis to lay in the face that the Gentiles had at no time law forbidding the practice of usury. And you all, and when you start talking about fair lending and lending practices, you want to get that biblical word usury, and usury basically means when we put unfair burdens on persons or unfair penalties on persons who are trying to get out of debt or deal with borrowing and lending. Conditions charged with the Gentiles, and that basically meant the non-Jews, that you could basically lend to them and charge them interest. However, modern Jews had to change that because once the Gentiles had a policy or fixed rates on interest, that changed the whole idea. Interest in Hebrew as a whole is this nishek, actually means bite or something taken apart. And what I found fascinating here is interest kind of changes his mind or the mindset. If you remember when we started, interest was from the perspective of the lender. Now interest is seen from the perspective of the borrower. Why is that key for the Hebrews? If you know the Hebrew story, you know that the Hebrews moved into bondage. They found themselves in bondage in Hebrew, and they found themselves in bondage in Egypt. And as they're coming out of bondage in Egypt and reestablishing their society, now is key that they start to establish rules and understandings from the idea or perspective of the marginalized. You'll hear from Sue later on that it's pretty much the marginalized persons that pay the penalty for what we call interest or high interest loans or high interest rates. Couple key concepts I think you kind of got to get when you talk about the biblical idea of debt is Jubilee. There'll be a little video a little bit later on about Jubilee, but basically this understanding that debt does not last forever, that there's a biblical mandate that after a certain period of time, we are released from our debts. That's the same concept we get the laws and our understandings of bankruptcy from, that after a certain amount of time, you are relieved from your debts. And we really, as Christians, as followers of the Hebrew and Jewish tradition, need to embrace these concepts of Jubilee, forgiving people when they've been in debt too long, and bankruptcy, allowing people to at least get out of debt when they've been stuck in debt and it's been harsh. Wanted to let you just listen to a quick video on the Jubilee relief from something called Debt Relief Radio. And while you're listening, I want you to kind of listen for what he says is the moral understanding of the question.
So many parts of the Bible that talk about the year of Jubilee and how every 7 years debts will be forgiven. And that's been incorporated over the years into different systems of law. And when the United States Code was written, it was incorporated into the United States Code as the bankruptcy section of the code. And we actually even carried through the time period up until just a few years ago. You could file bankruptcy every 7 years.
Really?
And it's not a coincidence. It's directly from the Bible. I have the information on my website if you're interested in reading the specific.
Is it Old Testament or New Testament?
It's the Old Testament.
Old Testament.
Yeah,
Interesting.
it's mentioned many times. So I've got that posted on my website. But a lot of times people they have a moral objection to filing bankruptcy. They think they're not doing the right thing. They think they're doing something that would be viewed negatively, in the eyes of in the eyes of God or whatever your belief system is. But it's just not the case. In fact, it's the creditors that are being judged for not forgiving the debt. So 7 years is plenty of time to be in debt. And I mentioned this last time, but human beings were not put on this earth to suffer, and we're not put here to be in debt for the rest of our lives. So that's why bankruptcy is really important.
Okay. Did you hear what he was saying? He said basically it's the creditors. People think that it's us moral, but basically it's the creditors that need to ask the moral question. When you're loaning people money, what is the moral question? What are you doing by loaning and charging high interest loans? What are you doing? Morality is that whole question of how am I treating this person? But he said most of the time it's the lender who had to do it, had to feel it, that feels shame and disgrace about things like bankruptcy and feels shame and disgrace about asking for help in any way. So I wanted to just point that out. I did lift some other traditional understandings of interest from the ancient Greece. We love talking about Plato, and basically Platonic law opposed receiving any form of interest. And Aristotle in his Politics characterized interest as the most unnatural category of earning. I just find that fascinating, the whole conversation that, charging people, especially unfair interest on borrowing money when they need it, how unnatural that is and unordinary. Demotion basically said that in 300 BC. We're getting closer to the birth of Christ. In 350 BC, before Christ, that basically Greece, the interest rate was 10% for ordinary and 20 to 30% lending for risky business. But by 200 BC, 200 years before Christ, the Greek island of Delos became the first financial center, and banking really was birthed in that point. In Rome, we always fussing about Rome and how bad Rome was and how Rome fell. But interest was outlawed around 340 BC, totally outlawed together. And I think that's important. And we need to understand that as well, that it was totally outlawed. And then if you look under the banner of Julius Caesar, you all remember Caesar. We all read Caesar in high school and did Caesar plays. The ceiling of interest rates was 12%, was set. And then Justin came back and it was lowered to 4 to 8%. So there was always this idea that you did not charge folk high rate, high yield interest. This is not only biblical, but all the communities and religious groups around the Bible also. The Quran, our Muslim brothers and sisters, here's a section from the Quran right here. It says, those who live on usury, as we said earlier, the unfair practices of lending and borrowing money, shall rise before Allah like a man whom Satan has demented by his torch. For they claim that usury is like the trading, but Allah has permitted trading and forbid usury. So even the Muslim faith right here is showing us the harm of this whole concept of interest and high interest. And here we are. Now we've worked our way into even the conversation leading up to 30 AD. That's after the time of Christ, Anno Domini. And Jesus Christ reacted against usury. And Jesus Christ entered the temple of God and drove out all who sold and brought in the temple and overturned the table of money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. He said to them, it is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of robbers. Oftentimes that passage is misconstrued in Matthew 21 as being about, selling in the church, but really what it's about is the money changers. And that's about saying the value of money can be lifted and lowered based on who is buying or who is selling. And to me, that opens the door for how we treat people who are dependent upon the system. We started with that song and went down to the rich man's house, but how do we treat people that have no other choice, that have no other help? And I think that is really what we should conquer. And as United Women of Faith, what you should really focus on and look at. I'm going to end with this last little video here about debt forgiveness and Leviticus 25 and Deuteronomy 15 and Jubilee. You'll hear one more form of predatory lending that Sue probably won't lift up too much, but student loan, but I like this video, so it's in there. So whatever. Here we go.
What I would like to do, though, is look to see what Scripture tells us about repaying debts. And what the Bible tells us undercuts not only all of these arguments in the student loan debate, but it undercuts our entire financial system. So we all know the Bible's concept of the Sabbath. One day every week is supposed to be a day of rest, one day out of 7. But the Bible also instructs us to have a Sabbath year. Every 7th year is to be a Sabbath year. Leviticus chapter 25 tells us that on the Sabbath year, you allow your land to lie fallow. In other words, don't plant crops on it. Allow the land to have a year of rest. And Deuteronomy chapter 15 tells us that in the Sabbath year, all debts are canceled. Now, if that sounds radical, to cancel all debts every 7 years, It gets even more radical as Leviticus chapter 25 goes on to describe the year of Jubilee. The year of Jubilee happens every 50 years. That is, after 7 cycles of a Sabbath year every 7 years, because 7 times 7 equals 49. So the 50th year is the year of Jubilee. And on the year of Jubilee, all property is returned to the original owner, except, by the way, houses that are built in cities. Not only that, not only is all property returned to the original owner every 50 years, but any time before the year of Jubilee, you're allowed to redeem or buy back any property that you've sold. Now, there's no evidence that ancient Israel actually obeyed this command for a Sabbath year and a year of Jubilee. But imagine how different our society would be if we followed these commands. It would mean that every 7 years, all loans are forgiven, not just student loans, but mortgages, credit card debt, car payments, you name it. Our entire economic system is based in large part on putting money to work to earn more money. Now, this would not affect the stock market. The stock market basically means you're buying a share of a company, that's called your stock, so that you can have a share of the company's profit, which is your dividend. And that, if we followed the Sabbath year and year of Jubilee, would continue to function as usual, unless the profits from your company come from banking.
Oh,
Because
here we go.
banking would be completely different. Banks make their profit on the interest that people pay on their loans. The year of Sabbath and the year of Jubilee would mean that all banks would have to hit a giant reset button every 7 years when all debts would vanish. And those who struggle under debt would get a reprieve. And the incentive for giving loans in the first place would be more about being open-hearted to people who are in need than about seeking profit for yourself.
That's where I wanted to get to. What is the purpose of lending, and what is the purpose of giving those loans in the first place? I'm running just a couple of things. Church law forbid charging interest when the Catholic Church got started. The popes were against interest, but only the Jews could still give interest because they were not Christians. So there was this conversation between the Jews and the Christians. So all of the persons charging interest became Jews. And then the Jews changed and said, oh no, we also believe in this idea of returning back and the whole concept of Jubilee. So then they didn't have, they were forbid from even practices with Jews. Last thing I want to live with is this Thomas Jefferson quote that I found on banking. I just like it. And it says, I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. If the American people allow private banks to control the issue of their current currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around the banks will deprive the people of all property until the children wake up homeless on the continent their forefathers, and it does say conquered. That's it for me for now. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to turn it over to Sue, and then we'll go for questions.
Okay. Thank you. That was really fascinating. I really appreciate that, Reverend Hooker. I'm going to share my screen now. I've got a not nearly as entertaining PowerPoint. I can't figure out how to put videos in. And I'm going to talk to you about let's see, I started at the end, high cost and predatory lending. And I've spoke with y'all before. I'm with South Carolina Appleseed. I'm Sue Berkowitz. Last time I spoke with you, I was the director of the program, and I'm happy to say I've been able to step down as director, and now I'm the director of policy, getting to just work on the issues that I really care about. And we have someone else who's running the organization. And that means that I get to spend all my time on things like trying to end predatory lending. And when I think about predatory lending and what it's related to, I think about financial health. And it is a understatement, a huge understatement for me to be able to say we have a predatory lending problem in South Carolina. There's three kinds of lenders that I really want to focus on because I think those are the three that truly cause the problems among folks who get caught up in predatory and high cost lending. It's not to say that banks don't have some responsibility. Problem is their responsibility is to do lending and do it in a cost-effective way, in a reasonable way, and they don't make loans to many communities and many people in our state. So the first group would be the finance companies. These are companies that often make collateralized loans that people can barely afford. Any small, medium, or large town in South Carolina has a boatload of finance companies. We know they have different names like World Finance, Regional Finance, Security Finance, Quick Credit. All of them do the same thing. They make small loans to folk with terms that are often hard to repay. The next one is auto title lenders. I bet there's not anybody here who hasn't watched the news and seen a Title Max commercial, which is all flashy and singing and making it sound like how easy it is to get the money, because it is easy to get the money, but it's impossible to ever pay it all back. And these loans are always more than $601 or more, because in order to charge a very high interest rate, not just to 80 or 90% interest rate, but a very high interest rate, like 200-300%, they have to make loans over $600. They used to call themselves 601 lenders, because what they would say was it's illegal for me to make a loan to you for under $600. That was not true. What is true is they can't charge 200, 100, 200, 300% interest if they make a loan under $600. And then, of course, we've always got our payday lenders. You must have a checking or a banking account. The loan is always $550 or less. Payments are automatically deducted from the borrower's checking account each payday. And the maximum fee that they can charge for every 100 is $15 per 100. But that actually turns out to be 391% interest. So what I want to be able to show you now is what happens to people when they borrow from each one of these types of lenders. Let's start with an auto title lender. They usually will lend a couple $1,000s, and let's use for this example $3,000. They make the loan for 2 years. They charge 300% interest. Do you know what the monthly payment is? $753 a month for 2 years. Now, that's more than some people's rent. That's more than the utility bill. That's more than the food. And people who end up borrowing from title lenders can rarely pay it back, because for the privilege of borrowing $3,000, at the end of those 2 years, the borrower will have paid back that lender over $18,000. That's $15,000 in interest for a $3,000 loan. And nobody can keep up with that. And if you can't, what happens? Your car gets repossessed. Payday lenders. Now, I will tell you, if I was making this presentation 10, 11 years ago, I would have told you about the 4.5 million payday loans that were made in South Carolina every year. That's right, 4.5 million. That's because the payday lenders were not following the laws correctly, and the regulators were not regulating the laws correctly, and that people were getting multiple payday loans at a time, 7, 8, 10, 12, 20 payday loans. Why? Because every time they borrowed money and they had to pay back the full amount, they'd who had the money. If you didn't have, at that time, $300 on March 1st, what are the chances you were going to have $345 on March 15th or March 30th when your payment was due? Now, the good news is you can only make one payday loan at a time, and there's a database. And payday lending's really gone down. Why? Because they can't make as much money. So they're going into other forms of lending. But in 2022, we know that there were 32,097 South Carolinians who took out at least one payday loan. Those are the individual borrowers in our state. And those 32,097 people took out almost 150,000 payday loans. That means that they were taking almost $20 million out of the pockets of people in communities who can least afford it. Now, some people take one payday loan and that's it. Out of the 32,000 people, 26,000, a little over 6,000, only took out one loan. But 33% took out 5 or more loans during that period of time. And almost 27% took out 6 to 12 loans. So this means that your average person borrowing from a payday lender took about 7 loans. And why is that? Because if you borrow $550, when it's due in 2 weeks or a month, you now owe $632.50. And nobody has that kind of money to pay back. If you're borrowing money from a payday lender, you're not going to have that kind of cash available to yourself. Then we have our installment lenders. In 2022, 1 billion, 100, you know what? I wrote this down wrong. It's 1,181,526 consumer installment loans were made in South Carolina. 44% of those were renewed, refinanced, or flipped. That means the individual who borrowed the money and couldn't afford to pay it back repaid, the lender paid themselves back, and they made a brand new loan to the person, starting all over again with new interest and new fees. Only 25% of loans out of the 1 billion loans that were made were actually loans that were paid back in full. Only 25%. Almost 18,000 cars were repossessed from these loans, which are probably mostly auto title loans. More than 10,000 debtors filed for bankruptcy. And more than 13,000 additional actions on top of the repossessions were filed against borrowers. Of the $2.7 billion loaned, more than 589 million. These numbers are so big, I get myself confused. $589 million were more than 90 days delinquent. So we're talking about 20% of those loans are 90 days delinquent or more. The most frequent interest rate or APR rate for loans between $600 and $2,500, or 61% of the loans that were made, the most frequent annual percentage rate was 127%. 127% interest. And people are complaining because the feds have raised interest rates to 7%. The most frequent APR for loans less than $600, or 20% of all loans, was 193% interest. Now, these are just installment loans. These are not the payday loans. These are the installment loans. So how do we fix this? Well, last time I spoke with y'all, I was talking to you about an interest rate cap. And we did have a bill for an interest rate cap last year and numerous other times. And despite having 5 subcommittee hearings last year, we could not get an interest rate cap bill out of the South Carolina LCI subcommittee. That's how much money, time, and energy these lenders were using to fight against us. There are over 30 lobbyists representing these industries. So what did we decide to do? We realized trying to get a rate cap, and I wholeheartedly and every ounce of my soul believe we need rate caps, but more than anything, we need to cut these practices. So we decided we were going to get a bill filed that would make it an unfair trade practice, first of all, to send a live check to consumers. I don't know if y'all have ever heard of live checks, but some lenders will literally mail a check to a borrower, a real live check. And on the back of that check, it had little teeny tiny writing. It will have the terms, the interest rate, whether they're taking your collateral, how much you're going to have to pay. And they're targeting certain communities. And I will tell you, they're primarily Black and brown communities and always low-income communities, because they want to target people who are struggling to make ends meet because they don't make a living wage and costs have gone up. And when that check comes in the mail, it's like manna from heaven. And it gets deposited. And then suddenly someone's finding themselves owing payments they can't afford. But we also want to say that you can't make a loan to a consumer without looking at their income and expenses and document that this consumer can actually repay the loan. Because remember, I showed you in a previous slide how many loans are refinanced and how many loans are creditors or lenders paying themselves off and putting more interest on, and they're making hundreds of millions of dollars. It's because they're counting on people not being able to pay back the loan. So they'll get you to pay your interest off. They'll get you to pay all your credit insurance off. And then what they'll do is say, you know what, you're behind, but I don't want to have to sue you. I don't want to have to take your car. How about if we just refinance you and add all that interest back in and let you start all over again, because we're good guys. And I have had clients and consumers that I've worked with over the years who one of their longest relationships is with their consumer finance company, who goes and gets them to come back over and over again because the individual cannot afford to pay the loan in full, so that they can keep gouging money off of them over and over and over again. And we want to make this an unfair trade practice. And you know what? We hit a nerve, because they're fighting us tooth and nail all over again to make sure that they don't have to do that. They don't want to figure out if somebody can afford to pay it back. They want to figure out how they get someone on the hook and they keep them there so that they are a constant payment source for them. So Senate Bill 910, it's a bipartisan bill. It was filed in the Senate. It had 4 subcommittee hearings. It had a full committee hearing. And I will tell you, if you want to see that hearing and hear the bill sponsor just chew them out, you can go into the State House website, and all of those videos for the LCI, Senate LCI committee are on the web and you can see what was said to them. So it's now on the floor of the Senate, and somebody's put an objection on it, and they are, as far as they're concerned, it's never going to be heard. And there's a good chance it can't be heard. But we need you. We need you to let Senate leadership, your senators and the leadership members of the Senate know that there needs to be a vote on Senate Bill 910. And you also need to let them know when it comes up to vote yes on the bill, not to support it, because they'll always support you. We need them to vote yes on those bills. Because if we can get this bill through the Senate and to the House, and we can get these practices stopped, we may never get an interest rate cap, but we can stop the very practices that are causing people to have to borrow and reborrow and having hundreds of millions of dollars taken out of the pockets of low-income people and out of communities that can least afford it. We can stop that practice. But the other thing we need to do is we need to make affordable credit available to all in South Carolina. I also say go work with your local community banks and credit unions to develop programs that will allow people to access needed credit. You know, what these predatory lenders always say is, well, if we don't lend, nobody will lend to them. No, the reason people go to predatory lenders is our community banks and our credit unions are not in the communities that need them. And they don't have products that make it affordable for people to borrow. And they can make money back from folks who are low income. Because if you can take out a loan with a reasonable rate, you can pay it back. Being low income does not mean you don't pay your bills. Poor people pay their bills, but they also have to pay more for everything. And this has got to stop. And this, through Senate Bill 910, that is a huge step that we can take to stop these practices. So I'm here to answer questions along with Reverend Hooker.
Okay, thanks, Sue, so much. And yeah, we want to field some questions. I'm sure you all have questions. Sue told us exactly what we need to do. You all may remember, I was going to spend some time on that, but after looking at the information, you all may remember that 2 years ago, the annual conference passed a resolution to suggest that we form payday lending caps, but now we're transitioning, and your advocacy area for the annual conference will push to deal on this whole idea behind the Senate Bill 910 and looking at how do we change the tide of lending in South Carolina. So questions, I know you all got plenty.
You can put your questions in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself and ask your questions. Feel free.
Hello.
Patricia, I see your hand up. Did you have a question?
Yes, sir, I do, because I'm not aware. In terms of the church, particularly the United Methodist Conference, do we have institutions, or, I mean, is there a good number of institutions, if we have them, that people can go to if they need to borrow money?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So the South Carolina Annual Conference does not. The United Methodist Church as a whole does not. The product that you're talking about is small. Most of these loans are small loans. And most banks do not provide small community loans. You know, 5 years ago when we were talking about this subject, one of my members in particular had taken out a loan for $300 to help her daughter pay a utility bill. That $300 had put her in a cycle for about 6 years of $3,000. What we need to look at is some churches in Ohio came together as the Federation of Church League and started making small loans. And you know what they found out? They found out that the people they made those loans to paid the loans back and then gave money to the credit union to begin to pay and let other people make loans. There was one incident in South Carolina, some of you all may remember. Cherokee United Methodist Church and Cherokee Shalom Zone got together and formed to open up a credit union. However, there was a change in the amount of deposit that credit unions needed. And at the time when they opened, they needed right at $1 million to have a credit union. By the time they got ready to process and start to make low interest loans and small dollar loans, the amount that the credit union needed was over $2 million and they didn't have it. So the credit union never really was able to establish that practice. But there's also churches and instances, you all need to hear this, of churches literally paying off these loans for individuals and for members so that they don't stay stuck in this cycle. And sometime if a church or faith group will go in and work with those particular lenders, they'll get scared and back off the dollar amount of those loans because they know most of the time they were done, if not illegally, immorally. But to answer your question, I want you all to hear this answer clearly. No, we do not have in the South Carolina Conference, in this United Methodist Church in South Carolina, a way for people to borrow $165, $200 for a light bill or for a car repair or for something that is really, and that would be, I know I'm spending a lot of time on this question, but that would be an awesome opportunity for a church group or for a group of women or to set up these types of loans. Because a lot of time when you see it, it's a mother trying to feed a child, trying to get to work, trying to keep lights on, and we don't want them to get in this vicious cycle. I hope that helped. Are there other questions?
There's a couple of questions in the chat. What was the website address for the State House, the legislators?
www.scstatehouse.gov. Or even easier, just Google South Carolina State House and that website will come up.
And I want to lift up something that I've just learned recently. There's a lot of conversation now after you all have gotten so good, United Women of Faith, of sending letters and going on and having group letters. Now our representatives and senators are saying they really appreciate phone calls, because once we shifted to writing letters and sending out group letters and mass letters, now all of a sudden they really appreciate phone calls. So, hey, look, if they really appreciate phone calls, let's call. Sue can probably make it available, but we have legislators that have supported the 910 already and have listed. We'll try to get that out to you. And we want to thank them for supporting. We also have legislators that have objected to the bill and tried to sidetrack the bill. We want to call them now, and we can still write too, but we want to call them and say, hey, this is so-and-so from such and such United Methodist Church or such and such Women United in Faith, and we don't want you to abuse our sisters and brothers and our children with these unfair practices of loans, and we want you to support, Sue said not support, but we want you to pass and vote yes on S910. So that's the new ball game. Pick up our telephones and call. And some of us would be happy to get back to that, because I don't know where some of those emails I sent went. Do some districts have more people making these high interest loans this heavily located in some areas within the state. Yes, as Sue said earlier, it's a minority communities.
Mhm.
It's those areas with more minorities that have more loans. You drive down the streets in certain communities, come through Lake City, you see loan place after loan place after loan place, because that's where people are hurting. That's what people are, and they have gotten so crafty now. Time to go back to school, get school supplies, take out a loan. Time for vacation, take out a loan. Time for Christmas, take out a loan.
Mhm.
Pulling on people's heartstrings that are really trying their best to make it.
Yeah, if we took made a map, we did mapping in different areas. And what we did is we put where all the auto title lender and payday lenders were located. And then we looked at it by zip code. And it was to a T, just across the board, except for Horry County. Everywhere it was Black and brown communities.
Gail asked a question. So we should forget about Senate Bill 518 and write about Senate saying Senate Bill S910. Yeah, but let's not say forget. What we want to do is do like they do us. We want to go ahead and get S10. We want to get S910 passed. Then we're going to double back on rate caps, and we'll come back to that. But right now, what we're being told is that rate caps right now are impassable. But you know what happens if we change the industry again, then they won't have as much power, and we can come back and talk about rate caps at a later time. So let's not say forget, but right now our focus needs to be Senate Bill 910.
Yeah, that bill actually has a much greater chance at traction than 518. It's just further along. But now they're realizing that they never thought, I can tell you, I can promise you that the lobbyists in the industry never thought this bill would ever get out of full committee. And they did everything they could to not let it get out of full committee. Senator Davis, who is the primary sponsor, and I'm going to tell you, Senator Davis is a conservative, libertarian Republican from Beaufort County. So he is not, somebody who you would think would have automatically gotten this. He's a free market guy. But what he recognized is there's nothing free in the market when it comes to these kinds of loans, that the practices are entrenched and that they're extracting so much wealth from the very people who cannot afford it that it had to stop.
Okay, also in the chat, Angela asked, how do we discourage them from coming to our community?
You mean opening a new business?
It looks like that, yeah.
I mean, I think the best way to do it is to get responsible lenders and programs for responsible lending in your community. Because if they're there won't be a market for these types of lenders. And that's why I really do push on a regular basis that it's not going to be enough just to get rid of these lenders. We have to make sure that those who are responsible lenders, not just that they donate to the church for an event, but they actually come up with products that are affordable for people so that folks do not have to go to these bad actors anymore. Yeah. It says SCTEA. Oh, you're on mute.
what is the timeline for calling about when is the vote going to be on the S910?
Well, right now the bill is on the Senate floor and there is an objection on it. That means that as long as one senator says they object, it doesn't get heard. So the calls need to start now. And as many calls as you can get generated to every single senator, we want them to start talking to each other going, are you getting those calls about this bill? They need to feel the pressure now.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
And one of the things we want to keep in mind is the United Women of Faith is a part of the advocacy arm of the annual conference, and you all work and relate directly to us. I would suggest that you all may follow up with this meeting and ask the advocacy arm to put forth another resolution that deals directly with this lending practice. Now, what you want to do, because we know how slow our church works as well, is you want to suggest that we look at the issues around Senate Bill 910. So those are the issues of providing resources. Those are the issues of ending the unfair practices. And therefore, we can even mention the Senate Bill 910, but what we need to do is frame it in such a way. So I would suggest that you all may want to suggest to your representatives in connectional ministry that that's something that you look at for this time.
I have a question. Should we all be calling the senator who's objecting?
I always think it's the best folks that you should call are the is your senator. Because that's what they're looking at. They're looking, they have to hear from people who can or may not vote for them because of this. Mm-hmm. And so if you can generate lots of pressure on your own senator, that's going to make more of a difference, because the senator that's objecting, if he gets calls from around the state, the only ones that are going to matter are the ones from his district. And that's what's so wonderful about your group, is you're from all over the state. And so that's pretty powerful, that you can generate, you can go back to your places of worship and you can get people to make those calls. And suddenly they're realizing, oh, we can't just hide up here, and they know about it at home now.
Okay, are there any other questions? If not, I want to thank Reverend Hooker and Ms. Berkowitz for taking the time to speak to us about this important issue that's facing a lot of people in our state. So let's get out and call our representatives or our senators in the State House and let them know what we think about it and what they should do. So I want to remind you that the next Legislative Advocacy Day workshop will be on Saturday, February 24th at 10 a.m. And it's going to be focusing on being the village, keeping kids in school. So please put that on your calendar and plan to attend. And also, I want to remind you that the next book study on the book, So You Want to Talk About Race, is going to be this Saturday, February 17th at 11 o'clock. And if you didn't join the first session, we just covered the first 2 chapters. So there's plenty of the book left to go over. And we had good discussion at the first session. So please join us on that. So since we're at the end of our session here, Reverend Hooker, would you send us out with a prayer?
I will. And since Sue was talking about this whole issue of my great slides, I have a slide prayer for you that I just really want to share in closing. So I hope you all don't mind, but yes, let us bow our heads for prayer.
discussion, and our entire economic system would be different if we actually followed the Bible. Would you pray with me, please? Lord, we're so used to the way that things operate in our world right now that we can't even imagine a different way. And for some of us, hearing what you describe in the Bible might even sound like socialism or communism, even though it is a bit different from that. But Lord, what you offer, what you teach, challenges us. So help us, Lord, to receive your challenge and to rethink things that we take for granted in order to see them not only in a new way, but in your way. Amen.
Amen. Thank you all for having me. And Sue, have a blessed night.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Yes,
Thank
you
you,
all have a good
everyone.
evening. Thank you. Great program.